Here we are. Okay. Hello, everyone. Let me get a beautiful slide up on your screens. For those I'm not yet familiar with, I'm Julianne McCall. I'm with the Journal of Science Policy and Governance as the very honored Director of Programs and Events. My day job is in the California state government. I work in science policy advising in precision medicine in the governor's office. I'm delighted to be joined by a number of absolute leaders in the civic science space. I've been inspired by their bios and their visions for the next step. And so something special for you here on this panel. Let me see. I'm dealing with a woeful number of windows here. Oh, goodness. Okay, so that's me. I am delighted to provide just a couple-minute introduction to the Journal of Science Policy and Governance for those of you unfamiliar. Then I will go ahead and hand it off to our wonderful moderator for the day, Dr. Jamie Vernon. But before I do so, for those of you unfamiliar, we are an internationally recognized open access and peer review publication. We cover every of science and technology policy. Through the journal, we bolster research and writing credentials for early career scholars in science policy, as well as encourage them to engage in policy discourse and debate. We provide the tools to make that happen. We provide, various opportunities for articles in different formats, including op-eds, technology assessments, policy memos and analyses, white papers, even book reviews and workshop proceedings. So for those of you who have something to share, we are glad to see it come in any format you're most comfortable with. We also promote the publication through our global mailing lists and events, such as workshops and even a podcast, webinars like this as well. We organize events to published work and have had published authors actually share their work in various avenues through an RFI and on Capitol Hill. You can see a number of testimonials that we've added to the slide deck. We, of course, have social media presence on Facebook, Instagram, X, formerly known as Twitter, as well as a YouTube channel. We'll be posting this recording to join our compendium of others that we've provided in the last few years. If you want to follow us, I'll post a few of our accounts in the chat in just a moment, as well as a link to our newsletter subscription page where you can keep up to date with future events. So some testimonials from a wonderful author whose memo we published, as well as one of our own associate editors. For those of you interested in getting into the publishing and editing world, we do have an open call for associate editors at the moment. You can go to our website, which again, I'll post in the chat in just a moment to learn more about that opportunity. For right now, I'm absolutely thrilled to be facilitating this webinar on civic science for transformative policy solutions to societal challenges. No small opportunities here at JSPG. Of course, without partners like Signazai and the Rita Allen Foundation, we would have no runway to take off from. So I want to express just my deepest gratitude to Signazai, who's Executive Director and CEO, Dr. Jamie Vernon, is here to moderate the panel, as well as the Rita Allen Foundation, a close partner of Signazai's as well, in the work that they do. Our outreach partners, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, also have been integral to getting the word out. A number of you likely have seen the advertisements and are here today because of the ARIS, Advancing Research Impact in Society, Union of Concerned Scientists, engineers and scientists acting locally, as well as the California Council on Science and Technology. I'd like to, again, once more to thank our partners and sponsors for their support on this special issue and events. I'll also place a link to the call for papers momentarily. To get to this webinar, finally, in the Civic Science series, a final of 3 events making up the series, in which we're engaging thought leaders in the field to discuss the most important topics for the next generation to focus on within the civic science field. This webinar will focus on the role that civic scientists play in achieving positive societal change. We'll provide tools for the next generation to engage with policymakers, as well as discuss community engagement of various actors in civic science practices in a manner that's interdisciplinary, equitable, and inclusive. We encourage you to live tweet about the webinar and tag us as you see fit. So with that introduction, I'd like to introduce our moderator today. As I mentioned, Dr. Jamie Vernon is Executive Director and CEO at Sigma Xi, as well as publisher of American Scientist. He previously served as Sigma Xi's Director of Science Communications and Publications and Editor-in-Chief of American Scientist. He was also Sigma Xi's Co-Director of Operations, and as far as background, he's a molecular biologist by training. He served as a AAAS STPF Fellow and an ORISE Fellow in the Department of Energy. For more than a decade, he's been an advocate for the use of science in decision-making at all levels of government, business, and in our personal lives. He holds a bachelor's degree in zoology from North Carolina State University, a master's degree in biotechnology from East Carolina University, as well as his PhD in cell and molecular biology from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Vernon, I'm delighted to hand the microphone over to you.
All right, thank you, Julianne. That's exciting energy to get us started today on this great topic. And I just want to thank you as a representative of JSPG, Adriana Bankston, who is a Civic Science Fellow at Sigma Xi, actually helping us with a policy project. And just thank you for creating the opportunity. The publication is fantastic. This is our Sigma Xi's second special issue sponsorship, previously working on STEM education and workforce development, and now working with civic science policy. It's really exciting to be able to partner with you. And we have to thank the Rita Allen Foundation for also being a sponsor on this and really helping us move this ball forward. Rita Allen's not only a sponsor on this, but is a huge advocate for what's happening in the civic science space and helping to organize the Civic Science Fellows programs. So for all of you who are here today to learn about civic science with the interest potentially of going into civic science in some form or fashion, this is going to be a great discussion, and you have some great partners here and representatives from the civic science community. And Julianne, I really appreciate what you're doing out in California as well. So thank you so much. And welcome everybody. This is the first of these that I've been able to moderate. The topics related to civic science are important to me. As you heard from my introduction, I was a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, but that was after a long period of writing about civic science, blogging, and engaging around science in general and engagement with the public. So this is really close to my heart, this topic, and hopefully you'll learn some things today that will get you excited to craft your articles for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And most importantly, we really want you to have the information from today's discussion to translate that to what you learn into effective communication of science policy through the authorship of your articles. So we're going to go through a variety of topics, but I really want to introduce this excellent panel that we've put together for you. Martina Efeyini is the Civic Science Fellow right now at Science News, a great publication. And she's a science communicator and STEM diversity and education advocate. She's a Science News Civic Science Fellow, as I said, and her work focuses on using science journalism to engage younger audiences in science. And she's the director and founder of thenextscientist.com and a SAI TV advocacy contributing correspondent. So she's going to have some great things to talk about today. And then Daren Ginete is the associate advisor for the Science Philanthropy Alliance, and he is an equity-driven philanthropic advisor with extensive experience in research, healthcare, and program development. And at the Science Philanthropy Alliance, Daren works with funders in programmatic and grant-making strategies, as well as manages the Alliance's shared interest group on diversity, equity, and inclusion in science philanthropy. An important part of the ecosystem. The Science Philanthropy Alliance helps define what philanthropy should look like in terms of science and where investment should be made. Next, Elyse Aurbach, who's the Director of Public Engagement and Research Impacts at the University of Michigan. She's currently an APLU Civic Science Fellow, and she's a public engagement researcher, practitioner, and trainer, currently serving in those roles. And she focuses on supporting scholars to explore and realize their ambitions for research impact. And she was an NSF graduate fellow, a finalist for the AAAS Early Career Award for Public Engagement with Science, and an ARIS fellow. So she's serious about this whole civic science thing. And she holds a PhD in neuroscience. So she gets to apply that research to what she's doing today. And so it's exciting to have this panel and get the conversation started. We're going to talk about a number of topics. Firstly, how do we currently see the civic science community in terms of inclusivity? And that's just going to set the stage for the further discussion. Secondly, how do we engage various actors in civic science practices in a manner that is interdisciplinary? And that's core to what Sigma's Eye is all about, because we're a multidisciplinary organization and we promote interdisciplinarity approaches to science. Thirdly, what does it mean to have an equitable and inclusive civic science community? And finally, how can civic scientists drive positive societal change, and what kinds of tools and resources are needed? And I want to reiterate that this discussion is designed to help you think about what types of articles or papers would you submit to JSPG that can help advance some of these initiatives, or that some of these initiatives can contribute to how policy is made. So I think there's two ways to look at it. And I'm going to start by asking a question of Martina. Martina, can you tell us about your role and responsibilities in your organization in relation to building the civic science community?
Yes, so thank you all for having me. I'm very happy to be here. So I am a Science News Civic Science Fellow, and actually is wrapping up at the end of this month. So my work is about using science communication, specifically science journalism, to integrate it to inform the younger generations about science. In particular, Gen Z, in particular, teens ages 11 to 17. So a big part of my work about integrating civic science was, we got to talk to this audience. We got to talk to teens of today, because we're not teens. We were teens back in the day, but teens of today lived through a pandemic. They lived through racial injustice. They had to grow up very fast. So I know for my project, it was very important for me to talk to them first. And I was like, hey, do you want to be called teens? Do you want to be called adolescents? Do you want to be called teenagers? And it's something so small, but it was very, very important to me to really get that lens. Once I did that, I was able to talk to organizations that had teams and really say, what do you need? What do you want? But not come at it as a lacking, scarcity, or deficit model. I wanted to make sure they told me what they wanted. And then I was able to co-design with them. And as a result of a co-design in my project, I was able to develop a news media product, develop tools, and several videos for TikTok to reach younger audiences. So pretty much that is my work, and how civic science to me is about really co-designing with your audience and getting really to know your audience well. And yes, it's challenging, but yes, it's well worth it. And civic science, like I say, is about that connection and building relationships.
Fantastic. Thanks, Martina. This whole concept of co-designing is really a core principle, I think, in civic science. And it really, civic science, for those who are sort of looking for the definition, is in many ways how we do science and how we use science, right? So the co-designing process is not how scientists always operate today in terms of thinking about what science is going to be done and who that science is going to serve. And I think, Martina, what you're saying is, how are we going to communicate science and who are we going to involve in that process? So what have you learned? What did they say when you asked them, do they want to be teens or do they want to be adolescents? And what did you learn from that?
They all said teens, even technically like 11-year-olds are not teens. They were like, I want to be a teen because, you know, we probably all wanted to age up when we're younger, like, oh, I want to be 25 or whatever. So that still resonates with, you know, teens of today. Also, I learned that, you know, they very, very much love social media. Gen Z in particular are the digital natives of the world. And of course, you know, as a millennial, I grew up with technology, but not as much as Gen Z has. And I used to like make my own websites and build computers for fun. Like I was so geeky and nerdy. So, you know, it was really nice just like talking to them, and they were very curious about me. I was curious about them, but they were very curious about me. And that also speaks to like the co-design, like in the back I have embroidery. And they asked me about my art. They asked me, oh, how is it to be a Black woman in STEM? They were like, can I do that? So I was like, I had a mission, but then they asked me questions. And I really wasn't prepared for that. But I was like open and honest with them because, like, again, it is about building relationships and co-designing, and you have to get to know your audience. And it's also about being vulnerable as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And imagine being a practicing researcher and engaging with young people the same way, what you might learn from those discussions. So thank you, Martina. I'm going to ask a question of Daren now. How's your organization structured to facilitate civic science engagement, and which players do you engage?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. It was really, thank you, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. I'll say that it's really interesting because prior to joining the Science Philanthropy Alliance, I was working in research as a researcher, and then in educational program development and also in healthcare administration. And so didn't really have such a strong appreciation for science philanthropy before coming in. But what I realized as I joined the organization is that philanthropy and science philanthropy particularly plays a role in the research ecosystem as well. And so the Science Philanthropy Alliance is really a network of science philanthropic funders with the desire to advance scientific research. And really to facilitate a learning community, we connect funders with aligned interests with each other, not just among philanthropic funders, but also with federal and industry funders, with the understanding that science philanthropy is most effective when it complements the work of other sectors. In addition, we also facilitate connections to members of the scientific research community, including other leaders and researchers in the space, with really a strong appreciation on the knowledge of those directly working in the research space. And so it's always so fun to hear about Martina's work and really directly talking to Gen Zers and these different teens at different levels on what their interests are in scientific research.
Yeah, that's exciting. And, you know, when you think about Martina's work, there's funding for what she's doing. And the Science Philanthropy Alliance has the ability to pick and choose what organizations and what type of people get funded and what those projects look like, and where civic science principles can be incorporated into those funding decisions, I think is going to be something we see more of in the future. Do you feel that you made progress or learned something about where the philanthropies are looking to go in the future and how they will advance this concept of civic science?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I would say that it's interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, our goal at the Alliance is really about scientific research. And so that could be viewed as very narrowly thinking about just the research that is happening in the lab, in wet labs or bioinformatics or anything like that, right? However, one of the things that I've really seen among science philanthropic funders is the desire to incorporate science and society together, and really civic science at large. How do you engage? How do you think about the whole research ecosystem rather than just the research holistically? And so that involves thinking about the process of research, as you mentioned already, but then also what are the critical component of doing great scientific research that are beyond publications. And so it would be outreach and, for example, the communication work that Martina is very much doing in the role that she is currently, and even before then.
I know I'm muted. So it's true. A lot of folks are doing this work now. Many times it's done in a volunteer basis. If you're a grad student and you're doing this outreach, it's often something that's done on the side and not necessarily funded. Maybe we'll talk about how to incentivize that in the next conversation, or as we get through the conversation. But I also want to tell those who are attending, feel free to drop a question in the chat and I'll try to work it into the conversation. But I'm going to bring in our next panelist, Elyse, and see, how is your institution or how do higher education institutions create opportunities for public groups and communities to connect with science and scholarship? And are you guided by certain principles and practices that are most important for ethical, equitable engagement in what you're doing right now?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. It's a really great question. So I'll try and also weave in the plug for thinking about how to connect your work as a student with this work, because that's very much attached to my background. So if I think about the principles that guide the types of partnerships that I help to form and to catalyze between public groups and folks who are based at universities, I really think about sort of three big ideas. One, mutual benefit. Partnership really is not partnership unless both parties are getting something meaningful out of the equation. And I think that one of the things that's most important in the idea of mutual benefit is allowing each party to decide what that benefit is, and not having one party say, oh, we're going to give you X, Y, or Z, and this is what's beneficial. And so, especially in the contexts of scholars partnering with communities, like really thinking about how to create opportunities for mutual benefit is really key. Secondly, and goes hand in hand, is respect. So just as we as scientists are seeking to develop respect and to be respected in different types of spaces, if we're developing partnerships with other people, it goes back to the golden rule. We want to be treated as, we want to treat others as if we'd want to be treated. And so that involves a degree of humility and recognizing that there are different ways of knowing that can complement scientific ways of knowing. And when there are those types of complementarities in those partnerships, we can really do more as a whole than the sum of the parts. And three is around equitable partnerships. So thinking about mechanisms to share resources in meaningful ways, to share credit in meaningful ways, to elevate different priorities, to help set research agendas, things along those lines. And so when I think about how institutions of higher education can live up to these principles, I think about the types of structures and programs that they use and can create to support the people who are there. So when I was a graduate student, I don't want to admit how long ago, when I was a graduate student, a lot of the types of programs to support civic science and public engagement weren't really a focus of the educational curricula. And so I became part of the so-called grad SciComm movement, in part because I wanted that type of program to exist, because I wanted that training, right? And I think increasingly institutions of higher education are sort of picking up on this movement and picking up and joining forces with one another. And my project as an APLU Civic Science Fellow focused on elucidating on or articulating the different types of systems that institutions can put into place. And so I'll just name them, and I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has questions about them. But briefly, the types of things that institutions of higher education can do are change the way that they recruit people and the way that they retain people, so that they can make it equitable, inclusive, and focused on different types of scholarship and different types of experiences. They can invest in leaders to make sure that leaders are creating the types of programs and are supported in creating policies and programs that can support these environments. They can develop new infrastructures like new human networks, new centers. They can develop capacity building programs like training programs. They can create award programs such that you're celebrating work. They can use data and accountability mechanisms to do goal setting and track progress against those goals. They can fund different types of projects. And most importantly, I think for the folks on the call, they can really think about how to integrate civic science, public engagement, research impact work, any of this type of stuff into formal curricula and professional development opportunities for students.
Excellent. And what you just described, Elyse, is you've identified several things that can happen. And what what the Journal of Science Policy and Governance really is great for doing is giving students and early career researchers the opportunity to convert those goals into policy recommendations, or how can those goals help advance certain policy initiatives. So I think everyone who's on the call can hear what you just described and think about what policies would be needed in order to achieve some of those outcomes. And if I'm wondering, because a lot of what you're doing now, I think, is driven largely through a desire for cultural change in these institutions. So is that a more difficult or an easier task than perhaps implementing a policy?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I would say that they're both necessary, but culture wins it all. Culture is always going to win it all. So policy is really, really, really important. If you don't have a policy to be able to hearken back to be able to point to, you don't necessarily have an articulation of the institution's priorities, right? That's where those things get captured. And policy is only so good as you have the practices and the processes put around it in place to implement that policy. And even then, if you don't have people who are bought into those culture, or bought into those practices, bought into the philosophy that those policies and practices are intended to adopt, then the thing that you're trying to do is still going to fall flat on its face. Culture is going to win it all. And so, yeah, Jamie, the thing that we really focus on, and why I started with those principles, is like, in order to try and institutionalize things like mutual benefit and respect and equitable partnership, you can draft policies, but like you have to create the culture that really embraces those as core values in order to support them.
Oh, that's great. That's a great response, and not what I was expecting. So I love that even more. Someone's asking, really interested in the idea of culture change within institutions. How are you thinking about measuring that? And how do you know if there's been a shift in culture?
Melissa, that is such a great question. So I'm going to highlight one of the institutions that I case studied, or that I studied as part of a case study for my APLU work. And you can't find this online quite yet. The report will be released in November, but please know that this is coming soon. So this is actually at my home university, at the University of Michigan, but about 5 years ago now, a little bit more, the University of Michigan announced a strategic plan to help advance diversity, equity, and inclusion at the University of Michigan. And they had a really broad view of what diversity looked like, certainly racial and gender diversity, but also things like socioeconomic diversity, geographical diversity, or a diversity of religion. And the goal was to try and transform the University of Michigan to really have inclusivity at the heart of its cultural values, and have the idea of academic excellence inextricably tied to diversity and inclusion. And so one of the things that they did that I thought was brilliant, that speaks to the question that you asked about measuring that, is that they had two key strategies. One, the newly charged Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion instituted a culture survey where they surveyed students, faculty, and staff from all three campuses in the University of Michigan system about their perceptions about the University of Michigan's culture and campus climate around diversity. And so they got baseline data right at the start. And then at the end of the 5-year implementation plan, they re-implemented that survey. And critically, as they analyzed that survey, they reported not just at the institution level, but they also sent individual unit reports to each of the units that contributed data to it. And that was really important because it helped to feed into the second place of tracking our culture change. So the University of Michigan implemented what I like to call kind of like a hub and spoke strategy, where the university's central office for DEI developed the sort of template form of a strategic plan, and then sent it out to over 50 academic and administrative units to set individual goals to try and advance a culture of diversity in their individual contexts. And then let them set those goals and develop and track indicators against that progress. They required annual reports as well as a 5-year summative report against those goals. And what that enabled people to do is not just to think about the larger cultural markers of inclusion that got surveyed campus-wide, but also progress against the goals that were local and specific to the individual contexts, because an academic department is not necessarily the same as a service learning unit. And so I would say what I would take away from that is there are some standardized approaches that folks like Ode at the University of Michigan have already applied, and everything is contextual. And so there is both good, there are good approaches that you can look to, and you're still going to want to establish a plan and an evaluation approach that's specific to the unique context that you're working in.
Wow, that was a very thorough response and pretty impressive results there. So thank you, Elyse, and good question, Melissa. So next question for Martina is, we're now moving into a discussion about the actors and the tools and the resources that help us advance this concept of civic science. So Martina, how do the actors within the civic science community work together for making the field more inclusive? And I'm going to add, making the impacts more inclusive.
Okay. So when I think about actors, I was thinking about this question and I was like, actors really doesn't resonate with me. So I would change that with community partners and stakeholders. Because in all of my work that I've been doing, like throughout my life, my career, and also as a fellow, it's been about talking to community members, talking to stakeholders, like seeing how we can come together. So that language kind of suits my work better. And kind of like what I spoke about earlier is that we need to provide incentives for people to do this work. A lot of times the work in civic science is like a hustle project, a passion project, or a side project that a lot of times some universities, they don't say you can do that, or you kind of got to choose, or you're like, I want to do it, but then you get passion burnt out. And I definitely had that before. So you're just trying to like find a healthy balance that works for you. So I would say that what we need to do is try to find out how we can have, money and resources and people. So the people that want to do civic science, they can really do it well. And also try to figure out we can find ways that sustain the work that we do. And, training people as well, because, we are all thought leaders here, but you also need people to continue to do the work. So how can we implement tools to train the people that are interested in this type of work?
Yeah, fantastic. And great point there. You've got to support the people who want to do this kind of outreach and this work. Ooh, I lost my screen for a second there. I do have a question for Daren now. Daren, what are the best practices that are needed to make the field of civic science more inclusive, but also best practices for achieving those inclusive outcomes, as I mentioned before?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. Before I answer that question, I also wanted to just maybe follow a thread of conversation that Elyse and Martina had just started already on that culture change aspect, and then also thinking about civic science role. And so I'll say that one of the things, maybe as a response to that question too, is that one of the things that funders have been thinking about a lot is culture change. And so how can they enact culture change within the research ecosystem? And so we understand that they can create incentive structures, and so how can they continue to facilitate that more to really think about what the culture is and what do we want it to look like. And so some of our earlier conversations on culture change is really thinking about what do we want it to look like, and that can be very tough to even just visualize and dream about. The other aspect that I'll mention, as Martina talked about the resources for civic science, and that I've somewhat alluded to already, is that this continued interest of science philanthropy at large in the intersection of science and society. One of the things that I've really appreciated about, and so prior to being an associate advisor at the Science Philanthropy Alliance, I was a civic science fellow. And one of the things that I've really appreciated about that experience coming from research, where, as Martina mentioned, I was doing some outreach, but it's really not being viewed as part of the process of what it takes to be a scientific research. They're like, oh, put that work in your appendix, in your dissertation, if anything. And I was like, okay, I understand. And so I think what I've really appreciated about the civic science fellow experience is that it provided paid opportunity and experience for us to be able to do the work that we are very passionate about, that we do want to do, but unfortunately are not particularly incentivized in the current structures and the structures that we've worked with in the past. And so on top of that, I'll just mention that thinking about really how do we make the science philanthropy field a little bit more inclusive and really more equitable, is really this understanding that science philanthropy has benefited particular groups in the past. And so, for example, a landscape report commissioned by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation by Higher Ed Insights showed that 44% of science philanthropic funding goes to only 10 institutions. More strikingly, 51% of science philanthropic support that are specifically targeted for underrepresented populations only goes to 10 institutions as well. And so really both data indicated that there's continued equity in science philanthropy space. And so I think one of the things that we've really prioritized in the work that we've done at the Science Philanthropy Alliance and among our network is really trying to expand that. Thinking about members of my awarding and creating programs for members of minoritized groups. And I'll just want to say that really specifically for race, because this thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion has really been motivated by the racial injustices that occurred in 2020. And so I wanted to highlight that aspect. Beyond supporting individuals, it's also thinking about institutions and different institution types. And then finally, we know that there's certain regions across the United States that get more philanthropic support. And so thinking about the middle of the country where they don't get as much support. And so the landscape report that I mentioned also showcases a beautiful figure on looking at, I think, a heat map of where philanthropic money across the United States happen. And as you could probably expect, they're mostly at the coasts, on the West Coast and then East Coast. And so how do we also think about the middle of the country where it's an integral component of the research ecosystem, but do not necessarily get a lot of funding? And then really thinking about how do we start to address that? It's really about engaging different stakeholders at the federal level, at the academic level, and then also at the industry level. But really at its core is really about empowering those whose voices have been previously discounted. And so we have to rely on those voices and empower those individuals. As Elyse mentioned, leadership about these individuals are super important to facilitate this work forward. And then as Martina has done, it's talking to them and really being intentional about what you're hearing from them and bringing that up to all your conversations. And so I'll stop there. I'll stop there.
Oh, that was great. You could have gone on for a while. I think everyone would have been fully attentive, but thank you for that deep response. I want to ask Elyse, I think there's probably some grad students and early career folks on this particular webinar. How do early career scientists and researchers develop the skills to engage with different groups and communities ethically and equitably?
Yeah, such a great question. So I would say there are two big areas that I would recommend almost everyone learn about. And one is called participatory research methods. And this goes by a lot of different types of names, right? So it can be participatory action research or community-based participatory action research. It can also be things like community-based participatory research. So like there are lots and lots of different ways to do this, but basically the idea is learning the types of approaches that enable you to form a partnership with a community organization or group or individual, and work with them as co-equal partners to develop a research question, think about what the methods are to address that question, and then answer it together, and then think about how the implementation of what you found might impact that community. So that's one area. And you can do this by taking classes, by seeking out mentors in addition to any mentors you already have who are expert in these topics, or by finding community groups who you're interested in and who have a history of mentoring students like you. The second area that I'd recommend everyone get in touch with is some of what Martina was talking about, just science communication. Science communication is both an art and a skill, and it's something that you can absolutely learn and be taught. And so there are both local organizations, including ones that are student-led. I founded one when I was a graduate student, and national organizations like Compass or the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science that can give you lots of different opportunities to learn and develop those skills. But I think that at the core of it, the single best way to develop these skills is to do things. And so I strongly encourage you to sort of evaluate your landscape, try and figure out where there's a gap that might intersect with your interests and passions. And then if there isn't something that already exists, either make it or partner with others to expand something to fill that gap. Another really important, valuable way that you can even dive in is by writing an article for the special issue, right? Developing an idea and pitching something and articulating something in a publication venue is one of the really key ways that you can practice science communication skills and that you can use as an opportunity to identify some of those gaps.
Great advice there. Excellent advice. And, you can often look to your professional societies to offer some of these trainings and give you the opportunities to do some of these activities as well. So always keep that in mind. I have a question here from Denyaja or Denaya. Do civic science projects influence policy? Is it more likely to happen on a local level rather than a national level? And where do you see room for improvement? Would anyone like to take a shot at that question? I think it's tough. Civic, I think I'll throw an answer out there, and civic science projects have the opportunity to expose policy needs. So perhaps, you're talking about these cultural changes that Elyse has so eloquently described. I think you'll find that there are barriers out there that might only be addressed through new policies. And that's not just legislative policies, that might be a policy within your institution. And so in that way, when you're actually conducting or implementing a civic science project, you will discover a policy opportunity. And that becomes a way that policy gets shaped through doing civic science. And I would definitely say this is often on the local level, but national level is an opportunity ripe for policy as well.
I'd say that it can. So I think that civic science, citizen science projects absolutely can shape policy. The question is a couple of things. A, how is the project developed? So who are the partners that illustrated the need that Jamie just talked about? Two, who's involved in the collection of the data? And is there like an avenue for the collection of the data to link back with the people who charged or like established the basis of that need? And three, like, how do you communicate and disseminate the results? So the types of citizen science or civic science projects that I've seen directly influence policy frequently relate to things like ecological management. So like I live in the Great Lakes region, right? There are civic science projects that are related to things like fish populations and invasive species. Like there's a type of invasive carp that is attacking aspects of the Great Lakes watershed and the Great Lakes system. And so there are civic science projects that had a basis in the legislatures of the states surrounding the Great Lakes that said, we need to understand more about this data. And so, or more about like how this species is infiltrating the Great Lakes and what we can do about it. And so they partnered with researchers to help collect that data. The researchers set up civic science projects that are working with fishermen and other folks to try and evaluate like who gets caught when they're doing fishing. And then that sort of creates a nice feedback loop. So it can. The question is if you've set up the process, at least in my opinion, to enable those types of policy impacts.
And then I'll also chime in that I do think that it also can occur at different levels. And so I know that for some within our thinking about the work that we do at the Science Philanthropy Alliance, some funders are particularly focused on the local level, some are at the state level, and some at the federal level. And then I'll also just give a brief shout out to one of our civic science fellows at the Science Philanthropy Alliance before I joined in, and we intersected a little bit in my previous role as well. Karen Andrade. Karen Andrade is an amazing researcher and a civic science scholar, really, who thinks about the intersection of science and society. And after at the Science Philanthropy Alliance, Karen now works at the White House at OSTP and really thinking about policy changes. And then I think I will also say something that I've been hearing about a lot in science philanthropy in some conversations is that we have to think about that there's a this CHIPS Act that will provide massive infusion to the resources. And so actually understanding where the researchers might see where that funding can go would be super helpful. And I think one of the things that I've really appreciated in our conversations among different leaders in science, philanthropy, and beyond is really that we do want to hear about what researchers really think, what policies are. And so this particular call for papers is super helpful to understand where the ideas are at and where the changes are at. I think in general, people are very receptive, and so super excited to hear what ideas might emerge from this conversation and beyond.
Great. Thanks, Daren. Well, my next question really follows right on to that. And it's a little more introspective, looking at ourselves in the field of civic science. And it's for Martina. What are the policies that we need today to increase diversity, equity, inclusion within civic science?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So what I would say is like doing all the work that we're doing now and how, Elyse works more in like the educational part and working with students and how kind of like, we really got to think about curriculum. So it's kind of like top bottom approach versus bottom up approach. Like who are the high leaders, who are the deans, et cetera, that have the power because they have to make the change at the institution level and then it could like trickle down. So like for like scientists like ourselves, where sometimes, like I had mentioned before, it wasn't considered like work. It was like you do this on the side outside of your work. How can the curriculum be changed that is respected and that you can actually get paid for that and you can like integrate it into your curriculum? Like I know a scientist, her name is Efeyini. She works for STEM Media, and she for her PhD, she was able to craft her own PhD program because she wanted to do science communication. So like, and I'm hearing a lot of stories of people doing that. And it's like cool to invent stuff, but it would be nice if it was already established. Because being an innovator sometimes is exhausting and we want to pave a way so other people can continue to do that. So I would say we definitely have to figure out how we can do things at the institution level. And that also kind of ties into what I put in the chat about legacy organizations. I work at a legacy organization. We just turned 100 years old last year, and we're trying to, make different changes. I talk to other people, other organizations who are also turning like 100 years old, and they're like, how can we make a difference? And what I say is like, you cannot do the same stuff you did 100 years ago. Like you have to make this change now, like today. And if you're like, I don't know how, you have to get younger, fresher people with different perspectives than your own, and you have to do things very extremely different. And then sometimes it will be a radical shift between legacy people and people that are right more in the modern, where they like, I don't want to do this. But, like for example, at Science News, we have two different audiences. We have legacy audiences, we have younger audiences. They want different things. Therefore, we have to communicate with them in different ways. My project was about young people. We cannot use the same strategy that we're trying to do, seasoned, retired scientist professionals. And then also for the cultural part, how can we connect the dots of cultural needs as well in science?
No, that's great and very specific with this generational divide. I think that's such an important thing, and it's something Sigma's Eye also has to address. We have one publication, American Scientist Magazine, similar to Science News, and we have two very divergent audiences. So it's always a tightrope that you have to walk, and it sounds like you're doing it really well. I want to ask Daren, how can we demolish or deconstruct the current models that Martina was talking about to transform to new current models in civic science to support inclusivity?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. And I think Martina started to, mention that a little bit and allude to it also already. And kind of Melissa's question in the chat have kind of jump-started us in thinking about culture change at large as well. But I think one of the things that I've realized is that there's really the importance of building community and having conversations and building your team to facilitate that change or transformation. What I've realized in some conversations is that sometimes you feel like you're the only one who has this idea or who want to make this change. But then being connected, for example, with the Civic Science Network, I was like, oh, people want this change. And we have the human power. And what did Elyse mention? Human network, which I really love, by the way, to be able to facilitate that. Because as individuals alone, we can't make this is I keep saying this phrasing, this is a systems level issue, and it has to be a systems level approach to be able to solve it. And so we can't do it by ourselves. And so building that community, understanding that, I think that will, and I also want to acknowledge that this can be a tough process. Culture change takes so much time, and we don't know how long it's going to take. We do hope that it will take, I know that there's some efforts that are thinking about 2030. There's one effort thinking about 2050. And so it can take a lot of time. But I think being part of a network will allow you to be like, okay, it's okay. We have each other and we can help support. And their wins is also your win, right? And so I think that building that strong community is a basis to transforming current models for civic science. I think the other aspect that I want to also share is that thinking about embedding these individuals that Martina is talking to in leadership positions and really providing them the necessary tools to succeed. It's not, and understanding that they do have the strength to succeed. They have not been given the all the resources that they might need to succeed. And so how do we keep providing that? And really, this is what I say, it's a very, very large yet surmountable task to position these individuals in a way, in roles that they can have a lot of power and influence in the space. And really, by having them in those roles, it's really amplifying the voices that have been underserved throughout this process. And really, maybe this is a good way to transition to Elyse as well, is really thinking about how do we facilitate that moving forward. It's really thinking about the different systems and structures, and how do we start changing those systems. And one of the ways to start thinking about that is through policy making, which this particular call is super fascinating about, and really understanding where your thoughts are on where we can push this work moving forward.
Well, that sounded like a handoff to Elyse, because universities are one of the systems that you're talking about within the entire system. So what do you think, Elyse? What can universities do? And you touched on this a little bit, but what are some more concrete examples of what we can do to make this change?
Yes. Oh God, such a good question. And I really can't underline anything that Martina or Daren said enough. Like everything that they're saying, I was like, yes, just preach that. So there are a few things that I'll try and connect the dots on. So one is that change is really communal. There is almost no such thing in terms of changing systems where there is a single inspirational leader who says, this is my grand strategic plan. We're going to do the strategic plan and like everything's going to fall into place and then everything will be done. Generally doesn't happen. What I've seen in institutions of higher education is that the most effective people are people like Michael Rios, who's at the University of California, Irvine, who spent literally several years working with the Irvine community to understand what the campus community articulated as the opportunities for the university to do better, and then building a strategic plan that has guided Davis's efforts around that. Another really great example is at the University of Missouri, who he's at this point now moved on to Kansas State, but there is a really important and influential vice provost who is there named Marshall Stewart, who helped to lead a very, very, very large statewide effort for the University of Missouri system to engage through cooperative extension with different community groups to understand what their priorities were to help set the research and engagement agenda for the University of Missouri system. Right. And so it is that process of listening and of building community that helps to create a plan that enables people to have buy-in. And so I think that that's one of the things that gets lost a lot of the time in these change conversations or in these policy conversations is where is the impetus coming from? And I think that if you can do a really good job with the engagement at the front end, you can create policies that then set up an implementation plan that meets the desired goals of the community that you've built. And so just underline underlining Daren's point about how change is coalition based and change takes time. Like these things are not things that you snap your fingers at. And to Martina's point, like if you're not building something with someone, you're not building something for them. So.
Great, great, great. So we're coming here. We have about 5 minutes before we're supposed to wrap up, and I could probably carry this conversation for another 2 hours easily. But we do have folks on here that, and and future viewers who are going to be thinking about, well, what can I do? What can I what would Elyse or Martina or Daren tell me to do to get involved and move some of these goals forward? So do you have any specific calls to action that you would issue to our viewers? That's an open-ended question to any of you. There you go, Martina.
So I was looking what I was going to say, and we kind of alluded to it a little bit in how we, as Civic Science Fellows, we always say we are boundary spanners. So I would say that to the people watching now or listening later, like think about yourself as a boundary spanner. We don't work in silos, we work in communities. Yes, we all over the world remotely, but we still can work very much well together. And we have proven that as Civic Science Fellows all over the world, from the US to all the way to Thailand, that we work really, really well. So, think about being a boundary spanner, think about thinking outside of the box, thinking about things that don't seem like they can go together, but they can. Or if they don't go together, why? Why can't they come together? And I believe that the money and the funding will find you. And also, listen to the other recording before if you didn't get a chance, because there's a lot of good gems there. And also, if this is the work that you feel like you really want to do, reach out to us. I'm pretty sure you can find out information. And good luck.
Great. Thanks, Martina. Daren or Elyse, any calls to action?
Yeah, so I'll echo Martina's, or at least one of the themes that Martina said, which is around self-reflection. So the single thing that I would tell you to do is to try and figure out where your sweet spot is. And when I say your sweet spot, everyone on this call has an intersection between the things that you're really good at, the things that you're really excited about, and something that the environment isn't addressing. And so if you can figure out what that sweet spot is that is at that intersection of those three things, then you have a key opportunity to become a boundary spanner like Martina is talking about.
All right, I think that's a beautiful segue, Martina, at least to what I wanted to mention as well. I think also once you identify that particular thing that you're passionate about, talk about it, talk to people about it, and share it with other people. I think what I've realized, actually, it's funny because as a researcher, I didn't expect to be in science philanthropy at large. And then I was just talking about, oh, these are my interests to one of my friends who was job searching at that time. And then, oh, I'm interested in science communication. This is my background, et cetera, et cetera. And then she actually forwarded me the job description and listing for the Science Philanthropy Alliance at that point. And I was like, oh, this sounds like a good fit. I should apply to this. And I think that's one of the things that I realized that I have not done a lot is, putting it out there actually works. And so talking to people that this is the change that you want to do, once you identify what is that unique thing, and then finding those environments and people that will allow you to facilitate the work moving forward. And so I think I can't also underscore the importance of relationships. The relationships that you build, I think these are things that you've probably been so cognizant about in all the work that you've done, but I will encourage you to continue to do so.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Daren. And I'll mention that there's two ways of going about civic science. One is that you go full into it. You commit yourself fully and you do what these excellent people in this panel have done, which is to find a path, find a career path that's based on achieving civic science. You can do this as a full-time job potentially, and there's organizations who, as you can see, are going to need more folks with this type of interest and background. And then there's also the way that a practicing scientist, if you want to stay in the lab and continue to do your research, but do it in a way that embraces the principles of civic science. And I think that both of those are compatible and will need everyone in the ecosystem to achieve the change we want to see. So thank you all. And I'm going to throw it to Julianne because I have a question. How can the viewers convert some of this conversation into papers and submit those papers? And maybe you can close us out. Thank you all.
All right. Jamie, thank you so much. Yes, the Journal of Science Policy and Governance wants your idea. We have this, the open call for our special issue in partnership with Sigma Xi and Rita Allen Foundation. I'll also place in the chat a direct link to the call for papers, as well as links to both Sigma Xi and Rita Allen Foundation if you're not already following their extraordinary activities and leadership. So yes, we genuinely look forward to reading your submissions, and feel free to reach out to us. We may also be able to connect you with fellow participants who agree to make their contact details available, as again and again, relationships are what drive the world forward, right? We are a world of people, not brick and mortar, not institutions, not rules. We are a network. We are a world and a network of people. So do utilize the extraordinary community that came together for today's webinar, and others within these realms. So I want to thank once again our moderator, Dr. Jamie Vernon, as well as our extraordinary panelists. My goodness, nothing gives me such hope for the world than individuals like the three of you doing the work, and pushing the boundaries of what's possible. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, again, Sigma Xi and Rita Allen Foundation, as well as our outreach partners, ARIS, UCS, ESAL, and for partnering with us on this event, as well as to our JSPG team for their help in planning this event, especially Dr. Andre Porter, Director of Communications and Public Affairs, and our CEO, Dr. Adriana Bankston. So feel free to reach out to any of us if you have questions about the call for papers for the special issue. Follow us on social media for more announcements. And as you're thinking about submitting to the special issue, recordings can be found on our YouTube channel in the chat once. So thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you. All right.